we're about to discuss the first two chapters of the book, The 12 People You Love.
Two? I'm only halfway through the second chapter.
We're going to be discussing the first chapter of The 12 People You Love by Roy Ice. And you see, this is what we want to do is we want this to be a fluid thing, and so depending on where you are, you can let us know in the comments, or if you have any questions, we can address questions in future videos. I want this to be a living, organic thing, so it's not going to be practice and rehearse. It's just going to be us having a conversation, not just us, but us having a conversation about the content of the book.
All right, so where do you want to start? Because I have notes. I always have notes.
Well, why don't we start with some of your observations of the text, and we can start with some of your initial reactions, observations as you started reading the first chapter of the 12 People You Love.
Okay. Well, so I don't know if I find it impossible to set aside, or at this point my primary lens is just perpetually colored by my work in teaching composition and rhetoric to college freshmen, but it's hard for me at this point to address a text, particularly a nonfiction text, without considering the rhetorical situation, as I'm always teaching my students. So starting to read this, I noticed that I had a lot of my teacher glasses on.
For some of our listeners, the rhetorical...
Oh, our rhetorical situation. So when we're talking about a rhetorical situation, it's the context in which this text exists, right? So the rhetorical situation of The 12 People That You Love is that it was published now in the 21st century. The three primary things that we think about are the text, the author, and the audience. So our author obviously is Roy Ice. I'm not familiar with the name personally, but from...
Pastor for a long while, worked at the Quiet Hour, now doing work with the division in one of the higher up ministries.
Great. So I can tell from our little blurb here, and from the way that Elder Ice writes, that I'm supposed to know his ethos probably going into this. So I'm assuming that he's an established Adventist name, and that just from his little blurb on the back, that he has an established ethos, that means credibility, to be talking about this sort of a thing.
Especially with discipleship, yeah.
Right. So he relies very heavily on his unspoken ethos, which I noticed right away. Just from the first chapter and the first half of the second chapter. So getting ahead of myself there. So our author then is Elder Ice. So that lets me know a lot about him. He's writing from an Adventist perspective specifically, that he's been in the church for a long time, that he's been doing ministry for a long time. So that is going to affect how he's writing, who he thinks his audience is, his voice, and of course his credibility, as I said. So those two things are linked. Our ethos is both our author and that author's established credibility. How much I believe what he's saying just by him being the person saying it. So that's our author. Our text, obviously, is a physical copy. That's actually an important part of the text at this point, how they're delivered. And I'm really impressed by the physicality of this text particularly. It makes me want to pick it up. I will tell you, I am not prone to picking up religious texts. I should qualify that a little bit. I'm not prone to picking up Bible study texts. It's not something that I personally really enjoy. I know that they are worthwhile. I've gone through several of them over the course of my life. I've been in the Christian church my entire life. I went to a private Christian school. I've done extensive personal study. At the college level, I've done additional study. I'm, of course, married to a pastor. We discuss our scholarly pursuits a lot, so I've had pretty extensive exposure to scholarly religious sources as well. But my experience with, do I call them self-helpy? I mean...
some of these can give off the self-help vibe,
right.
Yeah.
And particularly those that are marketed at women are intensely off-putting. They're demeaning, they're patronizing, they're sexist. So I have, particularly in my adult life, steered clear of anything with that visible kind of Christian branding on it. So this text itself, I'm visibly drawn to it. It's the way that they use them throughout the text. You'll see their use of space and color, not just the illustrations, but these kind of really appealing round shapes that are throughout, the use of the circles. I find that visibly appealing. To me, the text is visually marketed at my age group or someone with my aesthetic tastes, which says to me that the audience might be younger, might be millennials. The content, however, is not.
Before we get to the content, though, something I want to point out about the look of it, the aesthetics of it, is I find that the use of circles throughout the art, throughout the text, actually incredibly important on a symbolic level. Because part of the point that Elder Rice is making throughout the text is this idea of bringing together these people that you love, these people that you know, and talking about social spheres. And talking about this idea of bringing this circle in around a strong magnetic center, which is Jesus. And so I find that actually the use of circles throughout the text to be not only visually appealing, but perhaps even having kind of a deeper symbolic meaning as we go through the text.
Yeah. The text itself throughout is incredibly appealing. It's easy to read, which I like. It's in small bites. Each chapter is short. The first one is very short, but each chapter is short. I really
We're used to
like
reading
the
books
visuals.
with really long chapters. So.
I really like the visuals. The way that the pages are laid out, it reminds me of the project my students just completed in my English 112. We do a multimodal project where we study using 5 different modes of communication, so things beyond the written, and how that really does inform how we transmit our information. And so the way that this is transmitted, it makes it more appealing to me. I enjoyed reading it because it feels good to pick this book up. It's easy, the text is easy to read. I like the way that the paragraphing is done, and then the image and the way that the quotes are offset. It's all lovely to read. I enjoy the actual act of reading it. And then, of course, the content and Ice's style is incredibly accessible as well. That's important, I think, to everybody, but I will say that writing style and the use of particular types of grammar are incredibly important to me. And so this being fun to read, easy to read,
well edited, no serious grammatical errors.
Yeah, makes it a huge difference for me personally to read through and to want to keep reading. I didn't make it through the first chapter and be like, well, I'm putting this down. I'm like, oh no, I'll keep reading. I'll read through this to the end. This is something that I would keep reading even without the additional pressure to read it for us to discuss. I would just read it on my own, which is, I think, an important note. Go on, little guy. There we go. Okay, so the content.
So when we're talking about the content, one of the first points that Elder Rice makes is, especially by using the example of Dr. King, is he's saying, what would it look like? What would the way we do things, how we do things, what would it look like to somebody that's not part of our circle? That doesn't know our lingo, that doesn't know our history, that doesn't know anything about Seventh-day Adventism, or perhaps Christianity for that matter. Now, in today's age, finding people without no knowledge of Christianity is definitely on the shorter end, but I would say that most people have what we call a folk religion knowledge of Christianity, that they have some broad strokes, but they actually, and a lot of people that call themselves Christians even, have a very basic understanding of what a Christian is. Many of them don't read Scripture or have very little knowledge of Scripture. Many of them don't know the doctrines of their own denominations, and Adventists are no exception to this. I can't tell you how many Adventists I've taught where they have no idea of the basic tenets of Seventh-day Adventist doctrine. And so it's interesting sometimes for many of us who've been in this church our entire lives, and especially for a lot of us who are steeped in the ministry of this church, to ask ourselves, what would we look like to someone looking in? And so in the first chapter, that's one of the main points that Elder Rice is making. He goes on to tell the story of Dr. King, and Dr. King is like, oh, well, after observing these Christians, here are the things that they seem to be focused on, here are the things, and it seems like attendance is a big thing that they focus on.
How about I read the quote?
Oh, yeah. Go
So
ahead.
our quote directly from the book is, Jesus has definitely commissioned these people to go and make attendees. They are a sincere people. They definitely love their God and thirst for heaven, but they seem most concerned about attendance. Additionally, instead of word-of-mouth growth, they outsource their marketing. They mail out flyers to people they don't know, inviting them to come listen to a hired speaker they don't know, to talk about a God most of the church members don't really know. All of the people who don't know each other come together for a couple of weeks until the speaker leaves town. Some people stay, others leave. Who stays? It's difficult to tell. We never really knew them in the first place. A proper name for this might be strangerhood evangelism.
And I think that this is an incredibly fair critique. As somebody who's been part of evangelism series throughout my entire life, I've been involved with them from the church, the layperson perspective. I've helped do evangelistic series in Hong Kong and Tanzania. I've even preached evangelistic series. These are questions that at the end of the day have been left in my heart as well. Like, what are we really doing here? And what is really the goal of this? Are we trying to get as many people as possible to come into this building and into this space? And why? And how do we keep them? And I think that what they're making, and especially when he says the idea of strangerhood evangelism, I think that's an incredibly valid critique, because more often than not, like he said, we'll bring in a speaker that most of the congregation doesn't really know. They might know them in name, they might have heard their sermons and stuff in the past, but they don't really know who the person is. They'll come in, they'll preach their series, and unfortunately, and this is quite fair and honest, a lot of the evangelistic series we preach either go towards the realm of emotional manipulation or fear-mongering. I can't tell you how many times I've heard or even preached that if you left this meeting tonight and you got hit by a bus, where would you be?
I've heard so many of those.
And while for many that might be an incredibly valid question, we have to be really careful when we say things like that. And I think we have to be very responsible with our theology when we say things like that.
And that's going to connect directly to one of his main points in the second chapter, where he says that we've remained, he says, we want to move beyond our self-focused fear and trembling as we work out our own salvation. We should be beyond that. And I think because so many of us started our Christian walk, or have heard that repeated so many times throughout our Christian lives, this, well, do you know, that we constantly question our own salvation. And I think that's one of the real dangers of using that as such a prevalent and repeated evangelistic tool.
Yes. As we like to say in a lot of our sermons, we can stand with boldness on the day of judgment, echoing the elder John. We can stand with boldness in the day of judgment because perfect love casts out all fear. Mm-hmm. And if we believe in a God of love, and we believe that this God of love wants to save us, our salvation should be the last thing we should actually be questioning. Mm-hmm. You know, we should walk in that sureness of faith, and we should walk in that sureness of, I want to be saved, and I want Jesus to save me, therefore I am. And that's essentially what Scripture tries to repeat over and over. I mean, Paul even says we were predestined to be saved. And so I think that that's a really good point, that we should be, perhaps in our own lives, say, hey, am I okay? Do I feel okay with Jesus? And am I in a good place with Jesus? But because before we start trying to teach others, I think an important thing to do is to examine our own theology and say, well, what do I really believe at the end of the day?
So now at the end of the first chapter, which again is just essentially one page of actual text, at the end of the first chapter, he's making the point that...
No shade.
It's fine. It's an introduction. He shouldn't have called it a chapter. He should have called it an introduction.
Well, if Elder Ice is listening to this, then maybe he can comment on that.
Okay. So my favorite point is here in the last paragraph where he's talking about the kind of church or the kind of disciple that we've become. That he says we're going just from our couch to our pew and back again. And that's our entire Christian life. It's just between those spaces, right? That also, though, leads to my number one critique so far of the book. And again, this is because I work steeped in rhetoric, and not just rhetoric, but feminist rhetoric as well, there's more than one place that there's some alienating ableist language. And I know I'm sensitive to that. But in the very third sentence, but in the very beginning, he says he's not foreign to our country, but he is foreign to Christianity. And as the third sentence of a book, that is incredibly alienating. The word foreign already is so charged.
Right.
Particularly because he matches it to our country.
Yeah.
Why is that relevant? Why would that even come up?
Yeah.
We're already then assuming that we're in the United States.
Yeah.
Without saying that.
Yeah.
Otherwise foreign to our country, and then so what if he is?
And I think that part of the thing is that we have to be careful, especially since the book is stressing so hard the idea of circles and the idea of bringing people, like having the circle encompass people. And one of the points that we've always wanted to make about Christ is that Christ doesn't say, okay, well, Samaritan, Jew, and what Christ is saying is humanity, and Christ is trying to bring in this circle where we're all part of this circle together. And so I think language like that, while perhaps not intentional, can have that effect on people who are reading it.
It seems fully unintentional. The second one is already on the second page, where he's talking about the people moving from couch to pew and back again. He says it can also quickly morph that the church is producing from making... It can also quickly morph what the church is producing from making spiritual disciples into making the spiritually disabled. And particularly with the insidious nature of ableism, which is, if you're unfamiliar with the term, that our culture, our immediate cultural context in the United States, our mainstream culture, is ableist. That means we don't make spaces, we don't think about, we don't accommodate people that are not fully abled. And this is not just...
Or differently abled, as we like to say.
Right. And the community chooses different words.
Right.
But it can be anything from physical, let's say using a wheelchair for mobility, to mental, to other kinds of things as well. To the chronically ill is one that's close to my heart. I have more than one friend who suffers from lupus and amino deficiencies, things like that. And just that culturally we don't make space for them. Right. And this is a problem in the church as well. And using this word here...
Even the term shut-in sometimes can lead to this sort of mentality.
So just this sentence is using the spiritually disabled, my notes here, what he's doing, I believe unintentionally,
Absolutely.
Fully unintentionally, but the contextual use of that, the connotative use of that right there is then connecting disabled with unwilling and with stunted. And that's not okay. Even unintentionally, this is an ableist use of this word, because now we're talking about being disabled with being frozen, with being not dynamic.
I think a better way to say this would have been the spiritually lethargic, or even the spiritually apathetic. I think there are a few
apathetic would be perfect.
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways to phrase that could leave out some of that. Granted, we believe unintentional. But some of this ableist language that is so, as Cass said, insidious in a lot of our culture, even in our churches. So I think that's a very valid point to make here.
Particularly because he's immediately contrasting that phrase with growing disciples, which is an adjective, not a verb. I was a little confused there. Being a little literal. I'm very literally minded. So we're not growing the disciples. We are growing disciples. The growing is describing the disciples who are in the process of growth. So it was way too literal when I first read that. I was like, oh, we're growing them. No, we are the growing disciples, which I like. I love that that's the use of that term.
I mean, as we look around us with our setting and all these plants, like one of the things I love is that in our backyard here, I can look at every single plant, and I remember when Cass planted them, what Cass did to help make them grow, and how they come to look the way they do. And I think that with this whole analogy, what's really beautiful here is that, and perhaps something that really appeals to Cass and to me as well, is this idea of it's just this process. And it's a process that takes work, it's a process that takes certain resources and materials, and that it takes time to take these things. And when a lot of these plants started, there were these little shrubby things. Sometimes it looked shrivelly because she'd get them from Home Depot on sale.
And he was always like, did you put enough of those in there? And I was like, they're going to get big. It's going to fill. He's like, do you not want more? Just put more plants in there. I was like, no, they need their space. They're going to grow.
And so this idea of as we see the plants growing around us and making this beautiful garden. So the same with the idea of the people in our lives as we pour into them, and we pour and perhaps love and trust and faith and hope and a lot of these things as resources, we see them grow and mature into perhaps better people, more of who they're supposed to be.
I've always liked what you've always said about the use of the word perfect in the scripture. And the idea that Christ grows us not to be a different person, but better versions of what we are. Exactly like our favorite TV show, The Good Place. We were recently discussing the character growth on The Good Place. We highly recommend it if you have not yet seen The Good Place. But you watch the characters grow into better versions of themselves. They don't become different people as they grow and change and become what we would call more moral and ethical, more Christian, even people. But they become better versions of them. And I hope that's where we're heading here with growing.
Yeah.
With becoming that perfect version of ourselves, which doesn't mean flawless, but it means more of yourself.
Right. And one of the things that I think that Elder Rice rightly stresses here at the beginning, and I'm not recalling whether it's the first or second chapter, as my wife was telling me I should annotate a little better on that. But the point is that first off, we build relationships with people. We pour into their lives. We share life together. And I know right now that seems a little hard to do, but A, we're figuring out ways to do that, like what we're doing right now. And B, there's nothing that can stop human connection and interaction. Nothing can stop that. And so I think that when we pour into each other's lives, first off, we just pour into their lives just because they're worthwhile, and and we want to have relationships with them. And then it's from those relationships that certain conversations, all too often, we feel like we're expected when it comes to evangelism or discipling is to go stand on a box on a street corner and go, hey, you, follow Jesus. And sure, that might work in certain things, or leaving a glow tract on a bench. Yes, that might work in certain cases. Like, I don't want to knock that. But not always. I would even argue not typically.
I would say not well.
Or at least not well.
Yeah.
And so the idea of pouring and making connections. Connection is so incredibly important. Because when you connect with people, you care about them. They care about you. There's something real that happens there. And it's right there in that space between us. That's where those important conversations happen. And I think that's not only a God thing and a Jesus thing, but that's where Jesus works. And where Jesus draws people to him is through those connections.
Wonderful, yes, I agree.
Sound like a little preachy there.
No, that's great, that's great. I'm hoping that our conversations, that as long as they're between the two of us, will really be balanced with that, because those of you that have gotten to know Adam and I, Adam much better, he's the public face and the outgoing extrovert, right? Know that one of the things about our ministry, as we've come to think of it lately, particularly together, is that we're a good balance for each other. Adam is, of course, going to be looking at arguably the more important side of the content, the spirituality, how we connect this to our faith. And
would you say I'm the Mary of this?
yes, Mary, Martha. And I won't be able to shut it off, and I'm really unapologetic about that, actually.
I like it, though.
Yeah, so while I'll be looking at the text definitely from a different angle, I hope that these two approaches that we're going to have will make it a more enriching conversation for everybody. I know that a lot of the things I'm going to have to say about this book are not going to be the majority of people's reactions. I hope that you find that edifying and not, I don't know,
off-putting, I guess?
Off-putting. I know a lot of the things that I will try to slow down with a lot of my critiques, like Adam was having me explain a lot of the things that I think about when I come to these texts. My experience, though, is not unique. There are a growing number of people that experience things the way that I do, with the rise of formalized education, with millennials particularly being a much more formally educated group, we're going to approach these things from different ways. Along with that, our generation, millennials and then Gen Z after us, are increasingly, what's the correct word I'm looking for here? Language matters to us. The rhetoric is incredibly important. And while I've had a lot of people older than me in my life tell me to let it go, or that it's not important, or things like that, I can tell you from personal experience and from the experience of my friends, it is important. It's vitally important. And while it might seem nitpicky to you that I latched onto those two words particularly, the use of foreign and the use of disabled, particularly my friends in the disabled community will tell you that it's not nothing, that it's everything, that these things stack up and lead to them being left out. And that's the last thing that we as Christians want.
Well, I think it's super important with our rhetoric that we are not only as exact as we can be, because as I'm up there preaching, how someone interprets my sermon, it doesn't actually matter what I mean when I say something. My intention to some degree is actually irrelevant. It's how it is perceived and how it is received that makes a huge difference. And that's one of the reasons why I pray for God to speak, is that it is my hope and prayer that when God speaks in the sermons, it kind of helps with those barriers that we reach when we talk about the use of language as a vehicle of communication. So I think we not only need to be exact or good with our use of language and use of rhetoric. Intentional. We also need to be responsible. Because, like I said, unintentional, absolutely. But if we're trying to make what we say and what we write and what we do accessible to everyone, or as many people as possible, especially with younger generations who are more socially minded, communally minded, I would say responsibly minded, to be honest with you, when it comes to social justice and certain things like that. And I know that oftentimes social justice becomes a bad word in certain circles. We need to stop that, because I think it's being responsible and being morally, ethically, and socially responsible. And I think Christ was all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Christ knew where and Christ, I think, was intentional with everything he said, whether it was to the places of power, or it was to the people who were hurting and suffering on the streets. And one thing to note is that Christ, with his rhetoric, always punched up. And I think that that's an important thing that in our rhetoric. So sometimes when we poke fun or we critique certain things, we know that we are not, how do we say that with punching up? Like, we're being responsible with how we do that.
I mean, Elder Ice can take it, right? Essentially.
And probably would even welcome it,
I would hope, yes. I mean, he seems
super cool dude.
And that's the thing is I don't want you to think I'm derailing our conversation here, because I know that this can, if you're unfamiliar with kind of this deeper look at the rhetoric, it might be a bit off-putting at first. It might seem like I'm nitpicking. It might seem like I'm attacking. I'm really not. The content so far, as I've read, is valuable, is wonderful. As I said, I really enjoy...
it's really solid.
Yeah, I really enjoy his writing style. Whoever did the editing, he or anyone else, it's wonderful.
Yes.
I've really enjoyed reading it. But these are things that we need to be aware of. And particularly if Elder Ice is of a whole generation or two above us. I'm unfamiliar.
I would say probably Gen X.
Okay. This might not have crossed his mind yet, right? And going back to particularly ableism, it's, in my experience so far, in my intentional feminist experience so far, it's the hardest one to address. Because if you're not part of the disabled community, it can be so hard to be aware of all of those different experiences and all of those things that come along with it, right? In one of those ways, being able-bodied and all of that sort of thing, it seems so easy for us that these instances are harder for us to pick up, particularly if we're not fully aware of them yet.
Right. And I think this is super important, guys, because and some of you might be like, well, why are they spending so much time talking
I know.
about
I
this?
feel like I've derailed, and I'm really sorry about that.
But we haven't, and I want to say why. Is again, when you're dealing with your circles, and we'll get here. I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but Elder Rice is having as far as the 12 people, and next video we'll talk about why 12, who's the 12, details of the 12. Is that we're going to be very intentional in people that we're choosing to pour into and build connections with. And these are important things and concepts. If you haven't thought about them before, it's okay. We are all learning and we're all growing along the way here. We're learning every single day. It's important that we learn and we grow together. We learn with the Spirit and with Christ. The Spirit is constantly working inside of us to make us more moral and ethical and responsible. But I think it's incredibly important because there might be people in your circles that you never knew might need language like this. They might need to have some of these tools and whatnot, or they might need to hear these things from you as an ally, as a supporter, as a friend, or a loved one. And so it's incredibly important that we brush up on this, embrace this, and move with this, because I think this is actually one of the ways that the Spirit's actually moving within society, and Christ is moving in our communities by allowing us to love each other better. And so I say that it actually perfectly ties in to what we're doing here, because we're talking about growing disciples, right? And part of the way we grow disciples is we talk to people in a way that's not off-putting, that's not offensive, and that makes them want to spend time with us. Because I don't know about you, I hate being alone. I don't want to be alone. I want people in my life. And so one of the things I've learned is there might be certain ways that I talk, or certain expressions I use, or certain mannerisms, or what's the word for it? Colloquialisms and anecdotes that might not be appropriate. And it's been really interesting whenever I've had to learn that in our relationship and in our friendships. And I would love to go on this journey with all of us. And as always, if you have comments, if you have questions, if there's certain things you want to hear more of, if there's more conversations you want to have, we can make more videos to have some of these conversations.
We're hoping to find more technological ways to include more of you in these conversations too while we do this.
Zoom, Facebook Live, perhaps some of these other means, so that you can in real time interact with us. But in the meanwhile, we'll be looking forward to seeing your comments on Facebook or Instagram.
Yes, I think I've been posting them first on Instagram, and then they go to Facebook after that.
And if not, please let us know, because like I said, we're still trying to figure all of this out. We're working on transitioning more into a digital space, at least for the time being. But as my head elder, as Jonathan pointed out, this is actually good practice for us for later on down the road, when meeting together might not be a possibility for a number of different reasons. And so thank you guys so much for joining us as we are beginning this conversation. And is there anything else you'd like to add, babe?
Oh, well, for this format, we'll see you next week. But before that, we are going to be doing prayer on Wednesday. This video will probably go up on Tuesday, because we'll be distributing the books Tuesday, and then posting this video after that to give people a chance to read the first very short chapter to catch up and be part of our conversation here. So then, if that happens, tomorrow we'll be doing prayer. So reach out to us through Instagram or Facebook Messenger.
Or text.
We can connect there. Give us some more suggestions on how we might reach out to you, get you more involved. As Adam said, we're working on that and trying to figure out more ways. We're trying to reach out through text to get as much kind of feedback as possible, but we are all pretty isolated right now, so you reaching this way would help us as well.
Absolutely.
I think that's everything.
Well, all I can say right now is may the Lord bless you and keep you until we meet together again, and remember, continue to love each other.